One can regard the Critique of Pure Reason as the true court of justice for all controversies of pure reason. For the critique is not involved in these disputes, which pertain immediately to objects, but is rather set the task of determining and judging what is lawful in reason in general in accordance with the principles of its primary institution. Without this, reason is, as it were, in the state of nature, and it cannot make its assertions and claims valid or secure them except through war. The critique, on the contrary, which derives all decisions from the ground rules of its own constitution, whose authority no one can doubt, grants us the peace of the state of law, in which we should not conduct our controversy except by due process. What brings the quarrel in the state of nature to an end is victory, of which both sides boast, although for the most part there follows only an uncertain peace, arranged by an authority in the middle. But in the state of law it is the verdict, which, since it goes to the origin of the controversies themselves, must secure a perpetual peace. Immanuel Kant. So far I have talked very extensively about what philosophy is to Kant and what he wants with philosophy, and then also about the methods that Kant employs in philosophy. But of course, what Kant is actually famous for, and what his lasting fame and importance is based on, is Kant's actual philosophy, the content of that philosophy, namely Kant's critical philosophy, Kant's three main works, the three critiques: the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of the Judgment Power. And without those, we nowadays probably wouldn't know about Kant, or at least wouldn't read of Kant, and that means we also wouldn't care what his idea of philosophy is or what his methods of thinking are. That is not to say that Kant was completely unknown prior to his critiques. I talked about this a bit in the lecture I gave on Kant's life. Even before his first critique, his Critique of Pure Reason, came out in 1781, he was already well respected as a philosophical writer in Germany. Such important figures as Lambert, the mathematician and physicist, or also Mendelssohn, the great and well-respected Jewish thinker, had sought out Kant, had written to Kant seeking a correspondence. Someone like Lavater wrote to Kant that he was his favorite philosopher. And when you read through Kant's letters, there's also a letter by some guy who wanted to write a book about the most important philosophers of the 18th century, who wanted to dedicate a chapter of that book to Kant and to ask Kant about some information about himself. So he was by no means unknown or unimportant. He was well respected, but then again, so were people like Wolff, Baumgarten, Meyer, Crusius, Tetens. You could argue that maybe they were even more important and more influential than Kant in 18th century Germany. prior to his critique of pure reason. And yet nowadays, most people will never have heard of them. Even if you study at the university, I'm not sure, but I don't remember, except for Wolf, hearing any of their names during the several years I studied there. And you can assume that most people who deal with philosophy, including most professors even, will never have read any of them. But in their day, they were better known than Kant. So we can be sure that Kant nowadays would be as unknown as them if he had not published his critiques. And the reason I'm stressing that is because this should give us pause and this should make us think. Whatever or whoever is important or influential for 10 years or even for 100 years is not necessarily important or influential in the long run. I find that when the history of philosophy is talked about, so for example, you can go on Wikipedia and open some list of philosophers, or when you look at popular books about the history of philosophy, like books that claim to, on 100 pages, give a brief overview of the most important philosophers, I find that very often when it comes to past centuries, only the names that are most prominent nowadays or that have really been canonized get mentioned. And even great names that would really deserve a mention often get unmentioned. I have seen popular introduction books to philosophy, very shallow, very superficial books that basically skipped the whole Middle Ages. Maybe they gave one or two names of philosophers from the Middle Ages, but that was it. Or I have seen some books I've seen books like that which skipped important names like even Leibniz or Spinoza. But then when it comes to the 20th and 21st century, you often find in such lists that there's an overrepresentation of people from that age. And you often find people mentioned that are completely unimportant. Like any second or third rate professor of philosophology who teaches at some university somewhere suddenly gets mentioned in such a list or in such a book, alongside names like Kant or Hegel or Nietzsche or Plato, while other names that are certainly more important than this guy go unmentioned. And this points to the people making such lists or writing such books being very unaufkläred. It shows that they lack judgment of their own. They can't judge for themselves who really is important and who isn't. So when it comes to the past, they go by whoever has been canonized. So in other words, they let other people tell them who is important. That is why often you won't find someone like Fichte in such a list, even though he's arguably the greatest philosopher, but he's not in the canon like others are. And on the other hand, when it comes to the present time, there is no canon yet, so they can't tell apart who is important and who is unimportant. And this should also serve as an explanation for the future when I move on from Kant, when I go on and cover other philosophers, because I will probably not cover some more recent names that a lot of people will think I should cover, will think are important. Maybe even some of the most well-known and most influential thinkers of the last century, I will skip because, quite frankly, they are unimportant. In the grand scheme of things, in the history of human thought, we don't measure by decades or centuries. If anything, we should measure by millennia. And someone may be talked about a lot and quoted a lot for some decades, but still ultimately not matter much. But I'm also talking about this because this goes way beyond philosophy. This can be applied to all sorts of fields. Something can seem important and grand in its time, and something else may seem less important in that time, but if you look back some centuries or even longer later, then it may look different. I mean, how many people would be able to tell me who was the Roman emperor around the year 30? Probably not as many people as would be able to tell me the name of a certain Jewish preacher going around the Galilee and eventually being crucified in Jerusalem at the same time. Yet, if back then I had been in the Roman Empire and had asked people who is more important, that Jewish preacher or the Roman emperor, they would probably, in most cases, have said the emperor. And you can think for yourself, how many, for example, Roman emperors or how many American presidents can you still name? So you can see that even someone as seemingly important as the leader of a country and of a big country, in the grand scheme of things, can appear very unimportant. It's one reason why I often can't take seriously these political debates and partisan fights between rightists and leftists, and people treating the next election like whoever wins, whoever gets to become the next president or chancellor or prime minister or whatever, like the whole fate of the nation and of history will depend on that, when most likely both candidates no one will know in 50 years or in 100 years. And here I want to stress that unaufkläredness tends to be imprisoned by the moment. That is necessary if you think about it, because being unaufkläred means being unable to think for yourself. It means being led by something or someone else. Well, that means you will be impressed by the moment, by whatever you currently perceive, whatever sensations you currently have. To go beyond the moment you are in, to take a step back and view the present as if it was history, and to make your own judgments, to not be impressed by what is currently the most loud or the most big, but rather to really examine things and to really think about them yourself. You would have to be aufklärt. You would have to be able to think for yourself. And that is why you can always find people turning the moment into an absolute. I'm reminded of some girl, some 7th grader, so around 12, asking me who was my most favorite footballer out of 2 football stars she named. And I said neither. Both are completely unimportant, irrelevant people, which quite shocked her, and she insisted that they are so famous, they are so important, everyone knows them. And I said, well, no one will know them in a few decades, probably. I said, your own kids will probably not know them and not care about them. To which she replied that no, she would tell her children all about her hero. Well, that remains to be seen, I think. In some decades, when she is, I don't know, 30 or 40, she would probably have other concerns. And I asked her then about some football stars from the early 2000s, from the 90s, from the 80s, and of course she had never heard their names. And I'm not saying this because I want to spoil the fun of watching football for some kid. I mean, let her watch football and let her enjoy watching these footballers. But I am making the point that when people are more unaufkläred, the moment, so for example, when someone is famous at the moment, can seem very, very important to them, and they cannot even imagine that which now seems important to them ever becoming unimportant. So it is left to more aufkläred people or to history to make judgments. And once again, when we look at the 18th century, we can judge that those who at first were important, were prominent in German thought of that time, they don't matter nowadays. Kant matters because he criticized reason. And I now want to start getting into his whole critique of reason. I will go into more detail in future lectures and talk about the various parts of the critique of reason. For now, what I want to do is start by giving a general overview of this whole project and talking about what this project is even about. What does it mean to criticize reason? Kant's revolution in philosophy has, including by himself, has been compared to the Copernican turn. So when Copernicus showed us that we are not in the center of the world, with the sun revolving around the earth, but rather the sun is in the center and the earth is moving around the sun. What Kant did was an equally big turn in philosophy, or probably even a bigger turn. But when we talk about a turn, when we talk about a change, there's not just an after, there's also a before. And we can't really understand the after without first understanding the before. Because the turn is about a change, about a difference between the before and after. If the before the turn had already been the same as after, there wouldn't have been a turn. So you can only understand the change that happened by understanding what changed, by understanding from which state it transformed into another state. And that is why, before talking about Kant's own critical philosophy, I first want to say some words about philosophy before Kant, or rather about how Kant viewed philosophy before his critical turn. And that should explain why, as he wrote, he viewed the puffed up presumption of whole volumes of insights of this kind, as they are common in these times, with dislike, even with some hatred, and also why he became convinced that the path one had chosen was completely wrong, that the methods commonly used must multiply delusion and errors infinitely, and that even the complete eradication of all these imagined insights could not be as harmful as the dreamed up science with its damned fruitfulness. This judgment may sound very harsh. However, Kant included his own pre-critical writings in their judgment. I talked about in the lecture on Kant's life, I talked about how Kant, despite people wanting him to do so, wouldn't republish his earlier writings. He considered more or less all previous philosophy, including his own, to have lost its value. Well, to Kant, there are only three ways of doing philosophy. All philosophy must either be dogmatic, or sceptical, or, and that is what he eventually does, critical. So I will start with the dogmatic philosophy, because that historically, Kant says, is the first form of philosophy that came about. To him, dogmatism means that you just start doing philosophy, thinking about things, coming up with arguments to prove certain points, out of a blind trust in reason and in reason's ability to come to conclusions, to come to answers, to solve any problem that you give to it. Nowadays, dogmatism has become kind of a dirty word, and that is probably also in parts due to Kant's criticism of dogmatism. Nowadays, no one really wants to be called dogmatic, even if they are dogmatic. Because nowadays, a dogma, the word has mostly a religious connotation, and a dogma nowadays is more or less understood to be a blind belief, a stubborn belief that can't be changed by arguments in something. In the 18th century, however, dogmatism didn't yet have such a bad reputation. And there were people who would have called themselves dogmatics, or would have called what they were doing dogmatic philosophy, without considering this to be something bad, or without considering this to be an insult. And even Kant himself, despite criticizing dogmatism, doesn't have as bad of an opinion of it as we have nowadays. To him, being a dogmatic philosopher doesn't necessarily mean that someone blindly believes in something or is unwilling to ever change his belief. No, the dogmatic philosophers might use logical and rational arguments, and some of the arguments might be very well thought out, and they might also in some cases be willing to change their opinions when confronted with new and better counter arguments. Dogmatism to Kant doesn't mean that a specific position, a specific belief is stubbornly held, but it means that you have at the fundament of all your reasoning, all your philosophizing, the belief that the questions can be answered, through reason. Maybe they haven't yet been answered. Maybe you need to think more and employ reason more thoroughly. And maybe you have answered them wrongly so far, and someone else has a better answer that convinces you. But what is dogmatic is the belief that the questions you have, the metaphysical questions, are answerable by reason. For the dogmatics, Kant says the eagerness to answer certain questions compensates for a lack of actual insight. And the interest in certain things to be true, so for example, wanting God to be true, or wanting the immortality of the soul to be true and wanting to prove it, that interest compensates for the lack of actual proof, Kant says. This dogmatic philosophy is very old. It has existed in antiquity. So people like Plato or Aristotle were dogmatic philosophers to Kant. But it also thrived in its own day. Back in the age of Aufklärung in Germany, the greatest, the most prominent philosopher before Kant had been Leibniz. And later, after Leibniz's death, Wolff rose to prominence, who was teaching in Halle, at least until he was kicked out for daring to say that the Chinese could be moral and virtuous without having Christianity or even natural religion. And Wolff took up the thoughts of Leibniz and expanded on them or systematized them, and thereby became the founder of what was called the Leibniz-Wolffian school of philosophy. And this school Kant considered dogmatic. This school was then leading in Germany. So after Wolff's death, his student Baumgarten took over his professorship in Halle. And then after Baumgarten's death, his student Meyer followed. And they didn't just have great influence in Halle, but also beyond that in more or less all of Germany. As a side note, when Meyer died in 1777, the professorship was offered to Kant. I talked about this in the lecture on Kant's life. But Kant, by that time already a philosopher in Königsberg for about 7 years and not wanting to leave Königsberg, Kant declined. It would certainly have been interesting to see Kant teach at the heart of the Leibniz-Wolffian school in Halle, when Kant was, 4 years later, when he published the Critique of Pure Reason, was to become the greatest critic of this school of philosophy. And when Kant, however, declined this professorship of Meyer's, it was instead given to a guy named Eberhard, who was to be the last, well, I don't want to say important because he really wasn't important, but the last somewhat prominent professor and the last somewhat prominent defender of the Leibniz-Wolffian school. Eberhard would go on to viciously attack Kant and his Critique of Pure Reason, and Kant would respond writing a polemical answer, and it is very obvious that Eberhard was but he was not even a second rate or even a third rate. He was more like a 50th rate philosopher. He was nothing like Leibniz or even Wolff, who had founded that school. He was just the sorry rest, the sorry rump of what was left of that school after its slow decline and degradation. And on top of just not being a very great or very deep thinker, he was dishonest, he was insincere. He attacked Kant by purposefully misreading him and twisting his words, which is also the reason why Kant, who usually didn't do this, chose a bit more of a polemical tone against him. And with Eberhard's clear defeat by Kant, the Leibniz-Wolffian school's reign over German thought should end. Kant himself, however, was influenced by Leibniz-Wolffian thinking. He respected Leibniz and Wolff. He grew up in this intellectual environment. I talked in the lecture on Kant's life, I talked about Kant's school days at the Collegium Fridericianum, and the headmaster there, Schulz, who was a personal acquaintance of Kant's family, Kant's mother visiting Schulz's Bible circles, and this Schulz was also responsible for Kant going to that school and getting an education. He had noted the boy being very bright and had convinced his parents to send him to the school. This Schulz was, on the one hand, a pietist, but on the other hand, he was a Wolffian, and he was very influenced by Wolffian philosophy. And he tried to merge this Wolffian philosophy and the Wolffian interpretation of the world and also of God and of religion with his Christian pietism. So much so that Hippel, an acquaintance of Kant, who was of a satirical mind, that Hippel later wrote about this Schulz. When you listen to his lectures, it sounded as if Jesus himself and the disciples had all studied at Halle with Wolff. That was how Wolffian his interpretation of the Christian faith was. So Kant was clearly influenced by Leibniz-Wolffian thought, and he would use in his lectures books by Leibniz-Wolffian authors like Baumgarten or Meyer to teach from, even later in his critical days. In these later lectures of his, he would mainly criticize these books and he would differ from the authors in a lot of ways, but still he would use these Leibniz-Wolffian books as a basis for his own lectures. So it is not that Kant completely dismissed this whole school of thought, but he had always been an independent thinker. He had been influenced by it, but he had never been a Wolffian. Even in his very first text that he published at just 22, he already criticizes Wolff and Leibniz in some ways. And as he further grew and developed, he more and more became discontent with dogmatic philosophy of all kinds, including the Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy, for it being so uncritical of itself. Kant's critique of reason is mostly a critique of metaphysics. I refer back to my lecture on what is metaphysics. where you can hear about Kant's whole system of philosophy and of the sciences and its various fields. So he's mainly concerned with metaphysics, and he says the reason that the dogmatic philosophers have such a blind belief in their own reason's ability to answer all questions in metaphysics is that pure reason, so reason working without the help of experience, just pure thinking, is that pure reason is indeed successful at answering questions in other fields of science. Partially that is pure natural science, but most of all, Kant says, that is mathematics. In math, we don't use experience, we simply think, and we can think of a lot and solve a lot of problems by just thinking in math. And that, Kant says, impressed many dogmatic thinkers, like Plato, who famously demanded the students at his academy to know about math, to know about and be proficient in geometry. Or like also Wolf, who also was a mathematician originally. Kant says, well, they were impressed by reason's abilities to answer many questions in mathematics, and that led them to believe that pure reason could also answer metaphysical questions. And why not? If by reason alone we can know that the root of 16 is 4, and if by reason alone we can prove, when we have two sides and one angle of a triangle, how long the third side must be, then why shouldn't we by reason alone be able to prove whether there's a life after death or whether there's a God? This is exactly why to Kant it was so important to find the difference between mathematics and philosophy. I talked about this difference in my lecture on what is philosophy. I explained how Kant says that mathematics is cognition through the construction of concepts in intuition, while philosophy to him is cognition through concepts. And now hopefully it becomes more clear why this distinction is so important to him. Because if mathematics and philosophy, and that would then include pure philosophy, so metaphysics, if they were just dealing with different objects, as the Leibniz-Wolfian school had believed, if mathematics was dealing with quantities and philosophy was dealing with qualities, but their method of finding answers was the same, then there was no reason to be critical. Then there was no reason to doubt that method, that obviously works so well in mathematics, could also produce lots of answers in metaphysics. But if, with Kant, we believe that both sciences have completely different methods, then the success of reason in mathematics doesn't prove anything when it comes to metaphysics. In mathematics, you are constructing your concepts in intuition. So when you think about, for example, what is the shortest connection between 2 points, you are not just thinking about the concept of 2 points and trying to analyze that concept, but rather you can imagine 2 points and their connection in your intuition. And then you will realize that the shortest connection must be a straight line. Well, when it comes to metaphysical questions about God, for example, or about the soul, or about freedom, we don't have any intuition. We don't have any viewing of them. And therefore, the question remains if we can even answer our questions here. Now, Kant goes on to say that if there was only one system of dogmatic philosophy, there would probably never have arisen a critical philosophy, or even a skeptical philosophy for that matter. Because the only criteria for truth here would be the principle of contradiction. The principle of contradiction just says that A cannot be non-A. So a thing cannot be one thing and the opposite at the same time. And when something is contradictory, when something contradicts itself, then it is clear that it must be wrong. But Kant says it is entirely possible to come up with a whole theory, with a whole system of philosophy, of the world and of God and everything, that has no internal contradictions. I can even think up new powers of nature. I can imagine a system of telepathy or of spirits in nature. I mean, we see that nowadays in works of fantasy where the author is thinking up whole magic systems that are internally consistent. But of course, such a system not contradicting itself doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. But it means that we don't see that it is untrue. It means that we could believe in it because we don't find an error in it. And Kant says there is a natural inclination of our intellect, of our thinking and cognitive faculty to want to expand itself and not be limited. So we prefer learning a new truth, or what we think is true, over being told that we know nothing or that we can't know nothing. And this natural tendency for expansion, Nietzsche would say this will for power that expresses itself here in the intellect, makes it so that we wouldn't doubt a dogmatic system that doesn't contradict itself. On top of that, Kant says there's also a natural laziness in humans. Humans don't like to question their beliefs. However, luckily, there is not just one dogmatic philosophy. In fact, Kant says there always will arise different dogmatic philosophers who will come up with different dogmatic systems. And all of these systems might appear to be true because they are supported by seemingly good arguments and because they have no self-contradictions. But any onlooker will be faced with the fact that there are different systems that, while not contradicting themselves, clearly contradict each other. So he will have to come to the conclusion that at least some of these systems have to be wrong. That is what was the case in Kant's own day in 18th century Germany. Despite the Leibniz-Wolffian school of philosophy being so influential, it didn't reign German thought completely unchallenged. One influential and prominent thinker of the time was Crusius, and he was a critic of Wolff and of the Wolffian philosophy. He was, according to Kant, equally as dogmatic as Wolff, but he was dogmatic in a different way. And this had influence on Kant. This made him become more doubtful of the Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy, seeing that someone else could come up with a different system that also seemed to work. In his inaugural dissertation that he gave in 1770, when he became a professor in Königsberg, and I mentioned in the lecture on Kant's life that this work can be considered the first critical work of Kant's, the first work in which he expresses some of his later critical thoughts. And then afterward, it is succeeded by the decade of silence, in which Kant further thought things through before publishing his critique. In this dissertation, Kant still praises Crusius for being one of the most able philosophers of his time and for being a good analyst of concepts, who brings a lot more clarity into things that have been known only vaguely, only darkly. However, Kant's relationship to Crusius, or his judgment of Crusius, is ambiguous. In later lectures, you can also read Kant saying that Crusius says a lot of incorrect things mixed in with a few correct things, that his whole philosophy is full of pipe dreams and chimeras, and that his logic is so dark, so unclear, that you need another logic to understand Crusius's logic. But nevertheless, Crusius had an important influence on Kant, at least in so far as he made Kant more doubtful towards the Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy. If you lived in a world without lies, if you always experienced everyone always saying the truth, you would never doubt something that you're told by someone. Or if you had never experienced error, if you had never made a judgment that later turned out to be wrong, then you would never doubt yourself. But the moment you realize, even if it's only one single instance, that something like lies or errors can exist, then you can start doubting everything, because then you can no longer be sure if maybe everything that seems to be true is an error or a lie. And the same is true for the dogmatic philosophy. As long as you only know one dogmatic system of thought, and don't find internal errors in it, you have no reason to ever question it. But as soon as you find one single instance of someone believing something else, and also not having any internal errors, then you might start to question this whole system of thought. And indeed, when we look into the history of philosophy, we can find that in all these centuries and millennia, more or less all possible thoughts, all possible systems have already been tried. And to any position that was ever held in the history of philosophy, you can probably find someone else who held the opposite position. So when Heraclitus says that everything is in flux, everything is in constant movement and change, you have the Eliads, you have people like Parmenides and Zeno saying, no, everything is standing still. There is no change. There is no movement. There is only being, and being is. It doesn't become, it doesn't change, it is. Or when you have the Sadducees saying that the soul doesn't live on after death, that with death your life is completely at an end. You, on the other hand, get the Pharisees saying that no, the dead will rise again. People will live on after death. But even then, the question is, how exactly will they live on? Will they rise as the people they were before? Or, as the Pythagoreans said, is there a form of metempsychosis, that is, transmigration of the soul? Will the soul be reborn, reincarnated in another body, maybe even in another being, in an animal or something? Or you may find people like the Stoics or the Epicureans believing that the world is eternal, that maybe the world changes internally, maybe the world will at some point be destroyed, but then, as part of an endless cycle, the world will be rebuilt and a new world will take its place. But the world as a whole is eternal, not being made, not being destroyed. Or you will have a position like in the Abrahamic faith, that the world at some point was created by God. And also, when it comes to God, of course, you have atheists on the one side, and on the other side, you have people like the Leibniz-Wolffian school saying there is a God and that he can even be proven. But even then, even if you agree that there is a God, there are many, many different views on how exactly we should think of this God. So someone like Spinoza also believed in God, but not the same God as the Leibniz-Wolffian school. Rather, he was a pantheist. To him, God and nature, or God and the world, were one, which at the time in the 18th century was quite blasphemous and was considered to just be atheism. So when you were called a Spinozist, you were basically called an atheist. But which might even be the more consistent belief when you do follow dogmatic philosophy. At least that is what Jacobi said. Jacobi was another thinker, another philosopher in 18th century Germany, and he was the one to cause the famous Spinozism controversy. He caused it when the poet Lessing died, and when Jacobi, claimed that Lessing had been a Spinozist, so Lessing had subscribed to Spinoza's pantheism, and Lessing's old friend Mendelssohn, who himself was, in his thinking, greatly influenced by the Leibniz-Wolffian school and who was opposed to this pantheism. He tried to defend the memory of his friend and to claim that his friend had not been a Spinozist. But the controversy between Jacobi and Mendelssohn, in which other thinkers also got involved, including Kant on the side, it soon became not about Lessing and the question what Lessing had believed in, but rather it became about philosophy itself, about the Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy that Mendelssohn followed, because Jacobi was basically claiming that this philosophy, if you really thought it through, had to lead to Spinozism. That Spinoza had been the most consistent, the most consequential of these philosophers. And Kant, by the way, agreed with Jacobi here. He also believed more or less that the Spinozism, that the equating God with the world, was the only logically possible consequence of Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy. And this whole controversy in the 1780s, amidst of which Moses Mendelssohn also happened to die, this was kind of the nail in the coffin of Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy. This was what made people move away from it. And as it happened, Kant had just published his first critique. So this controversy that Jacobi had caused happened to be great publicity for Kant. It was one reason why the next generation of thinkers who were discontent with Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy turned to Kant's critical philosophy. But the point here is that to any position in the history of philosophy, you will find opposing positions, and all of them to Kant are dogmatic. It is very important that unaufkläred thinking is always superficial. It goes by the surface. It goes by what it is told. So when unaufkläred people are told that two things are opposing each other, that two positions are maybe enemies, they will just swallow that up. But aufkläred thinking is more radical. It goes deeper. It goes to the roots of things. Being aufkläred means thinking according to principles. So asking from which principle does a certain position flow. And when you do that, you may notice that two branches, even if they grow into opposite directions, might still be branches of the same tree growing out of the same root. You might notice that the dogmatic believer who claims to have proof for the existence of God, or the dogmatic unbeliever and atheist who claims to be able to disprove God, that they are the same. Or you might notice that the capitalist and the communist, that they are the same. Or that the leftist fascist and the rightist fascist, they are the same. Because no matter how opposed they are materially, so when it comes to the content of their thoughts, formally, when it comes to the principle from which their thoughts arise, they are still in agreement. In this case, with, for example, the dogmatic atheist and the dogmatic theist, they are both dogmatic. But this state in which you have various different dogmatic opinions opposing each other, this, Kant says, is exactly what may lead to an onlooker developing doubts about reason's ability to answer these questions at all, because he will just see that in metaphysics apparently you can prove or disprove anything and sound logical, sound rational, sound consistent. And that is what gives rise to the second kind of philosophy, that is to skepticism. Just like the word dogmatism, the word skepticism is nowadays often used more in a material sense. That is, skeptics are people who are skeptical, who are doubtful towards specific claims. So you have these atheists who call themselves skeptics because they don't believe in God. Even though in the Kantian sense they might be quite dogmatic instead of skeptic, because they might believe that it is possible to find truth. They just believe that the truth you will find is that there is no God. Um, or there are people who are called climate skeptics, even though they are just outright climate deniers who deny climate change. There's nothing skeptic about them. And they too are dogmatic because they believe that truth can very much be found. Skepticism to Kant, just like dogmatism means having blind faith in reason's abilities to answer metaphysical questions, skepticism means having blind distrust in reason's ability to answer metaphysical questions. As a side note, skepticism is sometimes extended and understood in a broader sense. That would mean being skeptical not just in metaphysics, not just being doubtful that you can find answers about God or freedom or the soul, but being skeptical towards truth in general, even in the realm of experience. So skepticism is often understood nowadays to be a position where someone will say, we can't know if anything is true. Maybe everything is an illusion. Maybe the whole world is just a dream. Maybe nothing of this exists. But here Kant says that is not a natural position to hold. Like the common natural mind would never arrive at such a general skepticism. But rather, Kant believes that all skepticism starts from metaphysics. So, first, when we go through life, starting as children, we are basing our knowledge on experience, and we find that is possible, that we can know things from experience, and no one will get to a general skepticism and question experience itself. But then, when we start going beyond experience, when we start doing metaphysics, when we start thinking about things like God or the soul, where experience doesn't help us, and when then we find that this doesn't work, when we find that there are different dogmatic metaphysical positions that are at odds with each other, then we may become skeptical towards pure reason. Then we may come to the belief that only with experience can we find truth. And only then, only once we arrived at this metaphysical skepticism, can we maybe turn back and start to also question experience. But if metaphysics had not made us skeptic, we would never have become skeptical against experience by itself. And Kant is also doubtful that anyone ever really was a skeptic in this broader, more general sense, that anyone ever really disbelieved in the empirical. He says those skeptics who write things like that nothing can be proven, the whole world might just be a dream, they probably don't really believe that at their heart. they just want to be a thorn in the side of metaphysicians, and they just want to push metaphysicians to think more deeply about what even is truth, and what even is proof, and how any truth, even the empirical truth, can possibly be proven. But anyways, Kant, as I said, he's dealing with metaphysics, and so just like dogmatism, skepticism by him is applied mostly to metaphysics. And here the skeptic, once again, is he who denies that reason can ever answer our questions. And this, Kant says, would have been wise if it would have led to a skeptical method. I talked about his skeptical method in another lecture. It is about, like a judge at court, suspending your judgment, not judging immediately, and first investigating further. That would have been wise. But what the skeptic does, and here it is important that skepticism to Kant is quite different from the skeptical method. What the skeptic does is he doesn't hold back on his judgment and postpones it for a time to first investigate further and inquire further and then make a more qualified judgment. But rather he refuses to judge at all, saying that it is not possible to make a correct judgment. But how would he know so if he hasn't inquired? That's why skepticism is just as blind as dogmatism to Kant. Because just like the dogmatic, the skeptic has not done a critique of reason. He has not checked and inquired what reason can or can't do, but rather the one just blindly says reason can do everything, and the other just blindly says reason can do nothing. This skepticism always comes later in history than dogmatism, because once again, at first our intellect wants to expand, and at first it has no reason to doubt itself. Only once it realizes that it's not so simple, that there are different dogmatic opinions that are at odds with each other, only then will it start to become doubtful. But still, skepticism is quite old. You find it in antiquity, in someone like Socrates, who famously said, "I know that I know nothing," who just questioned the dogmatic beliefs of others, but without offering dogmatic alternatives. You can find it in the Academy of Plato, not in Plato himself. That was a later development in the academic thinking. You can find it in someone like Pyrrhon, whom Kant greatly respects and holds to be a wise man, and who is an example for Kant for the skeptical method, which he himself employs. But skepticism also existed in the time of Kant, in the 18th century. The most prominent skeptic of that time is the Scot David Hume. British thought at the time was largely empiricist. It was under the influence of Locke, and Locke had claimed that the human being is born as a tabula rasa, that is, as an empty table, and then learns concepts from experience, including not just such concepts that are very clearly empirical, like the concept of what is a tree, what is a house, what is a dog, but including also the concept of causality. Locke would claim that when we are born, we have no concept, no grasp of causality, and then we experience causality in the world, and thereby we come to this concept. And here the skeptic Hume disagreed and criticized Locke and pointed out that in fact we don't ever experience causality. Rather, we have this concept of causality, and we thereby interpret our experience, but causality cannot be found in the experience itself. A very famous example of Hume was when you have two balls in a pool game, and one ball is rolling against the other ball. And then the second ball starts to move and roll away. All that you see is the first ball moving against the second ball, touching it, and then the second ball starting to move. But you don't see causality. You don't see the second ball moving because of the first ball. I mean, what would a because even look like? We can't see a because. We can't see a power, a force going from the first ball into the second. And therefore we think that there is a relationship of causality between them, but it is not something we perceive. And sure, we might observe the same thing 100 times, and we might observe that 100 times the first ball moves against the second ball, and then the second ball starts moving. Therefore, we might come to the belief that it is quite likely that the 101st time will be the same. But that is just a judgment on likelihood then. That wouldn't mean that we really have experienced causality. And Kant here points out that Hume is not denying that causality exists, or he is not denying that the concept of causality is quite useful and that it is smart and prudent in daily life to apply the concept of causality. All he is saying is that we can't prove that causality exists even in the realm of experience, despite it having a lot of usefulness in the realm of experience. And therefore, we have no justification to rise above the realm of experience, to go to metaphysics, to the sphere of the superessential, and to apply this concept of causality here. To, for example, say God is the cause of the world, when even within the world, even within the realm of experience, we can't really prove that something like a cause even exists. When it comes to skepticism, Kant identifies two types of it. One is dogmatic skepticism, and one he calls problematic skepticism. Dogmatic skepticism would say it is not possible to find the truth, while problematic skepticism would say maybe it is not possible to find the truth. I don't know if it is possible to find the truth. Now, dogmatic skepticism is clearly ridiculous. It's clearly contradicting itself, because the dogmatic skeptic would say, I know that I can't know, or I found the truth that we can't find truth. I mean, that is so obviously contradicting itself that it doesn't really deserve a refutation. Kant compares this kind of skepticism with a laxative that when you take it, doesn't just purge everything else, but purges itself in the end. But then the problematic skepticism that doesn't claim to know and to be able to prove that you can't know and can't prove anything, but that just, well, is skeptical, is doubtful of our ability to prove things, that needs to be taken seriously, and that is harder to refute. And Kant sees value in this sort of skepticism, because it can serve as a thorn in the side of dogmatic metaphysicians, and it can cure us of our dogmatism and make us more critical. Therefore, the skeptics serve an important function in the history of philosophy. Kant himself was greatly indebted to Hume. He said as much. So Kant had grown up in Germany with the German thought of the time, with the Leibniz-Wolffian thought. But when he read Hume, that made him, as he famously says at one point, that made him awaken out of his dogmatic slumber. And that cannot just be said about Kant. The same can be said one generation later of Fichte. Fichte read skeptics like Enesidemus or Maimon, and their skeptical remarks, their doubts towards Kant. And that is what led Fichte to see that there were still issues in Kant's thinking. And that is what led Fichte to further expand on Kant's philosophy. So the skeptic does have an important function. So Kant also says that he isn't necessarily needed because the dogmatics, as long as there are two of them that are opposed to each other, can also have this function. So when you have two dogmatics like Wolff and Crusius, who argue against each other, even though none of them is a skeptic, to a third party, to an onlooker who watches their debate, they can serve like skeptics, criticizing the dogmatic position of each other. Once skepticism has entered the scene, Kant says, this conflict between the dogmatic and the skeptical thinkers can go on for centuries. Again and again, a new dogmatic system can arise, and again it can be attacked by new skeptic counter-arguments, and then out of the ruins of the old dogmatic system, a new dogmatic attempt can arise. But eventually, this Sisyphus work has to tire people out. Eventually, people have to get fed up with that, Kant thinks. And then there are only two possibilities. One would be his critical solution, which I will talk about in a moment. The only other possibility Kant believes is Misology. Misology means hatred towards science or towards reason. So this miso is always meaning hatred. You probably know it from words like misogyny, hatred of women, or misanthropy, hatred of humans. And in this case, it is hatred of the logos, of reason, or of logy, of science. So misology can be one result. Kant is aware that there can be different reasons for misology. He is aware that there is a misology of envy, so a hatred towards science that comes from the non-scientists, the non-experts who are envious of the experts, and therefore they will deny science, they will deny the expertise of these experts. They will say, oh, all your scholarship, everything you have learned, it's just worthless, because thereby they become equal with the experts. They tear the scientist down so that he is on their level, and they don't have to feel lesser, or they don't have to feel like here they have to shut up their mouths because they don't know what they are talking about. And I would say that this misology of envy is very prominent in our own times, where you can find a lot of anti-intellectualism, of anti-science mindsets, a lot of conspiracy theorists who are driven by this misology of envy. But Kant says there's also a misology of disappointment, and that is not coming from the non-experts, but quite the opposite. That is usually coming from the experts, from the scholars, from the scientists, from the philosophers and metaphysicians, from those who at one point did believe in science, did believe in reason, and tried to answer certain questions with it. But then, when that failed, became so disappointed that they started to hate science and reason and started to dismiss it. But no matter what the reason for misology is, no matter if it's born out of envy or out of disappointment, the result will be more or less the same. It will mean that you dismiss science, you dismiss reason, and that you claim truth and wisdom can be found without them. Because misology is not the same as skepticism, right? Misology doesn't claim that we can't find truth at all. It claims we can, but not with science, not through rational thinking. Well, how then? There are two possibilities, Kant says. There is what he calls the reckless misology, and that is the misology of the mystics, of the fanatics, of the esoterics, who believe they have higher, deeper insight into truth, into how the world works, who maybe believe they have proof for God not through rational arguments, but because they had a vision of God and of heaven. And then, on the other hand, there is what Kant calls the timid misologists. They don't try to rise above reason, but rather they stay beneath reason. They insist on only being empiricists, on only using experience. They will say, I only believe what I can see. They will dismiss any arguments, any attempted proofs through reason, and insist that always you need experience. And they will probably claim to know things through what they call common sense. But this common sense, Kant says, is just a divining rod. You can claim anything is common sense. When you have no actual argument, no actual proof, you can always say, well, I just know that this is true, it is common sense. And this has the side effect that you're also saying, if you don't agree with me, if you can't see that this is true without a proof, then you lack common sense, then you're an idiot. But of course, Kant says this is ridiculous. If scholarship, if pseudo scholarship, and if actual science can't prove something, then surely it can't be proven any better without using science and reason. I would say this is like if you try to cut something with a sharp knife and it doesn't work. The knife is not sharp enough. The object you want to cut is too hard. So you now instead try to cut it with a blunt knife. The blunt knife probably won't succeed where the sharp knife failed. But that is exactly what the misologist is trying. When science, when reason fail him, he will stick either to mystical visions and insights, or he will stick to experience and common sense. Both of which surely won't work any better than reason did. Kant observed this misology spreading in his time, in the 18th century. In fact, amongst other nations like the English or the French, it had already basically won. There was no metaphysics in those other nations left. I mean, that is not to say that at university there weren't classes in metaphysics, but they were not really taken seriously by the more important thinkers. And those people who still did metaphysics weren't very influential. If you think of the important British or French thinkers of the time, people like Hume or Adam Smith, or people like Voltaire or Montesquieu, you will find that many of these thinkers didn't bother much with metaphysical questions. They were much more interested with more empirical matters, with more empirical fields and sciences, like matters of economy, matters of law and justice and state and history, natural science, physics, or they were interested in society and how society was governed, and in criticizing government, criticizing the absolute monarchy, or criticizing the church. But they were not so much dealing in metaphysical questions. I mean, in the 17th century, things were still different. There you still had important French philosophers like Descartes or Malebranche dealing with metaphysics. But when you get into the 18th century, there's not really any important French metaphysician. Germany, in fact, was considered a bit old-fashioned and backwater amongst the prominent thinkers of the other nations, because here metaphysics were still taken seriously. But Kant still observed this misology in metaphysics spreading in Germany too. The Leibniz-Wolffian school was slowly declining after the deaths of Baumgarten and Meyer. It had no really important and prominent teachers anymore. I already said that Meyer's successor, Eberhard, really can't be considered an important philosopher. And then when Moses Mendelssohn died, that was probably the end of that school. And in Germany too, important thinkers, important scientists more and more turned towards the natural sciences. We had important physicists like Lambert or Erxleben or Lichtenberg. And you can also observe that the new generation of intellectuals, people like the four great authors that are grouped together as the Weimar classics, So Herder, who actually studied with Kant, Wieland, and then the two more prominent ones, Goethe and Schiller, they, while still growing up in a time when Leibniz-Wolffian metaphysics ruled the universities, they didn't care much for those metaphysics. So they had clearly fallen out of fashion with the new generation of intellectuals. To Kant, this was not simply something to be sad about, so rather he saw a chance in this, because he believed that there was still interest in truth, and there was still interest in science and doing science thoroughly. He said that could be seen in other sciences, like the natural sciences, which weren't abandoned at all. So this interest in truth and in thoroughness could probably be applied to metaphysics again, Kant believed, if a better way of doing metaphysics was found. People were just disappointed with the old metaphysics because they more and more saw that it was deficient. And that gave Kant a hope that old dogmas would die down, that debates in metaphysics would become less partisan, less about defending the position of your philosophical school, your philosophical system, and a more thorough and more scientific metaphysics could be established through criticism. Because just abandoning metaphysics altogether is not an option to Kant. I already mentioned in my lecture on what is metaphysics that he believes we have to have metaphysical positions, whether we want to or not. The atheist also has a metaphysical position, just like the theist does. And he also believes that the metaphysical questions of God, the immortality and of the soul, and freedom are questions that are in the very nature of reason and that we can't just let go of. They are as important to us as breathing, Kant says at some point. And that is why, since dogmatism and skepticism in metaphysics don't lead anywhere, a third way is needed to completely reform and to lead to a rebirth of metaphysics. And that third way is the way of criticism. Here, Kant is trying to do what his sympathetic method that I talked about in a previous lecture demands. He is trying to find a middle path between the cliffs, as he calls it, of dogmatism and skepticism. This middle path, however, is not a dull, superficial compromise, but rather it is a true third position that tries to combine what is true in dogmatism and skepticism into something new and something better. And what criticism is about is turning inwards, so to say. That is the Copernican turn, turning everything around, just like Copernicus turned everything around when he made the Earth no longer be in the middle, but put the sun in the middle. So Kant is turning around because all previous philosophy had tried to get knowledge of objects. Even when we talk about supersensual objects like the soul or like God, we are still trying to find knowledge, to have cognition of an object that is outside of us. Well, Kant turns our reason inwards because now, in criticism, we are trying to have knowledge of the subject the thinking and the thinking subject. Reason is criticizing itself, right? The title Critique of Reason, Critique of Pure Reason, can be understood in different ways. It is a criticism of reason, but also it is a criticism by reason. Reason criticizes itself to find out what it can and what it can't do, to find out which questions it can answer and which questions it can't answer. So the previous philosophy had only looked at the objects, and the dogmatism had said we can have knowledge about the objects without really proving that we can. And the skepticism had said we can't have knowledge of the objects without really proving that we can't. Now the criticism is turning away from the objects, is looking at our own reason, and is trying to find out if and to what extent we can know the objects. So while all previous philosophy is concerned with cognition of things, either dogmatically claiming we can have such cognition or skeptically claiming we can't have such cognition, the critical philosophy is concerned with cognition of our own cognitive faculty. Cognition not of the things, but cognition of our thinking of things and of how we think of things and to what extent we can think of things. So it is important to understand that by criticism, by critiquing reason, Kant doesn't mean attacking reason, because nowadays that's how the word criticizing is often used. Then we criticize something, we mean to say it is shit. That is not what Kant means. He is not a misologist. He is not criticizing reason to say, oh, reason can't do anything, reason is useless. But rather to criticize means to inquire, to look at, to differentiate, and to really find out what reason can and can't do, so that afterwards we maybe can turn back towards the objects, and afterwards we can focus on trying to answer the question that reason can potentially answer. So the critique of reason in itself is not answering any questions. It is just trying to find out which questions can be answered and which can't. And afterward, Kant wants us to be able to focus on those questions that can potentially be answered, while putting aside those questions that can't be answered. But not putting them aside like the skeptic does, just claiming they can't be answered because it hasn't worked so far, but rather because that would always leave room for a new dogmatic philosopher trying again, trying to answer them in a new way that hasn't been tried before, but rather putting those questions aside because we really proved once and for all that they can't be answered and why they can't be answered, why they are beyond the limits of our reason. That is what criticism is about. I think it is no coincidence that this critical philosophy was developed in the age of Aufklärung out of all possible ages, and that it was developed at the very end of that age. It can rightfully be considered the very culmination of Aufklärung. Kant had grown up in this age of Aufklärung. He had been influenced by its thinking, and he, in a way, is the peak of this age. Because Aufklärung is about critical thinking. That is more or less what everyone knows. I am aufklärt if I think critically. The problem is that the concept of Aufklärung that people usually have is very superficial. They think they are aufklärt just because they put aside certain prejudices or certain superstitions. They think they are aufklärt just because they don't believe that a black cat brings bad luck anymore. And when it comes to being critical, they think they are aufklärt for criticizing others. The problem is everyone can criticize others. I mean, look at politics. Everyone is criticizing the other side. Everyone is criticizing the enemies and calling them dumb and evil and so on. And everyone has what is typical for unaufklärdness. Everyone has this victim stance, believing that they are victims and that all the problems and all of their own issues and all of their own suffering, it is all caused by others. And then they will, of course, criticize and attack those others, but they will never look at themselves, which, quite frankly, is pathetic and disgraceful. The aufklärt person would consider that to be beneath his dignity. The aufklärt person always views himself as a perpetrator. He always focuses not on how he is passive, how he is a victim, how others are to blame, but rather he focuses on his freedom, on what are his free choices and decisions, and looking at those and how his state that he is in is caused by his own free choices and can be changed by his own free choices. Because that is what Aufklärung is actually about. Not criticizing the others, that is very easy, but criticizing yourself. And this is what Kant does. He didn't set out to criticize certain philosophical books or systems or schools that came before him and explain where they are wrong, disprove them, and then try to establish his own system. If he had done that, he would not be as important in the history of philosophy. If he had done that, maybe he would have succeeded and gained some prominence for a time, and then the next guy could have come along and could have criticized Kant and Kant's system again, and once again establish a new dogmatic system. But what Kant tried to do is not just criticize previous systems and establish a new system, but rather criticize reason out of which such systems are constructed, criticize reason itself, criticize our own, and since he also is human, thereby also his own ability to have cognitions, to arrive at certain truths, to have understanding. And thereby he, in a way, brings philosophy back to that old Greek maxim, know thyself. And this is so very important. I refer here back to my lecture on what is wisdom according to Kant. This is so very important for the philosopher as the sage, as the wise one, so that he really can be the lawgiver of reason. I said in that lecture that all of philosophy to Kant comes down to asking what is the human. And that is what the critique is basically asking. What is the human? And the first of the three questions that lead us to being able to answer that was the question I said, what can I know? That is exactly what Kant is asking here. As a sage, as a lawgiver of reason, what can I know? So what are the limits within of which we can do science and we can use our reason and try to find answers to our questions, but which we ought not to overstep, because outside of them, our reason can't find truth anymore. I will add that Kant's first opponents, the first people responding to him, they didn't understand this. What he was doing was too new and also too deep, too radical, too aufkläred. They simply didn't understand it. They took him as if he was just a new dogmatic philosopher trying to come up with a new system. And that is why their criticism, their disagreement completely missed the point. So there were two critics of Kant's, two early critics in the 1780s, when he published his three critiques that were prominent. One of them I already mentioned, that is Eberhard, who was trying to defend Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy against Kant. The other was one Christian Garve. Garve didn't really belong to the Leibniz-Wolffian school. He had become prominent as a translator, both of ancient Roman Latin texts, but also of English texts. And he was influenced by both by the thinking of antiquity and their question of what is the good life, what is happiness, and also by the English philosophy of the time and the empiricism of the English philosophy and the moral sense theory that was prominent in England at the time, that philosophy which tried to base morality on feelings, on a moral sense of what is right and wrong. And this Garve belonged to what in Germany at the time was called Populärphilosophie, so popular philosophy. Those were people who said that the school philosophy, the so-called scholastic philosophy, of mainly the Leibniz-Wolffian school, it was too scholarly, too scientific, too abstract, too learned, and it wasn't really fit for the common people. And so these popular philosophers, their aim was to popularize philosophy, both in the way they wrote, writing in less scholarly and less scientific ways, but also somewhat in the content of their philosophy, in what they talked about, trying to spread philosophy to the non-experts, to the lay people. And I mean, you can give them some credits for this aim, because indeed, philosophy in a way needs to be popularized. That is what Aufklärung is all about. And that is what I try to do as not a scientist of reason, but an artist of reason, as Fichte calls it. That is, bring down philosophy out of the ivory tower into life and apply it to life. But the problem with these popular philosophers of the time was that they were often very shallow and superficial, and they tried to popularize philosophy by making it devoid of its substance, by simplifying it and making it shallow. Nevertheless, while Eberhard was insincere and, as I already said, attacked Kant through deliberate misunderstandings, this Garve was respected by Kant. He had more honesty, and therefore Kant also didn't get polemical against him. He considered his Garve's remarks not attacks, but rather remarks and criticisms that had to be addressed, and he in accordance with his sympathetic method and what I said in the lecture on that, he considered his conflict with Garve as a conflict of friends, not of enemies, a conflict of two scholars, two learned men who ultimately want the same, want what is true and good. And we still have lectures between Kant and Garve, and they are quite interesting and even beautiful to read. They exchanged lectures back in the 80s when Garve criticized Kant, and then there are letters again at a much later time. They wrote each other again when they were both already very old and close to their death, and talk a bit about their respective sickness or frailty. And here Kant again expresses his very deep respect and admiration for Garve as a person, and how he deals with his own frailty and sickness in a dignified, in a stoic, in a philosophical way, just as Kant wanted, and as I talked about in my lecture on the philosopher as a healer. Of Garve, who mainly disagreed with Kant on practical matters, on matters of morality, while Eberhard disagreed with Kant on theoretical matters. Of Garve, it can be said that while he didn't get Kant, and while he certainly wasn't a deep thinker like Kant, and while he certainly wasn't that important or didn't leave a big mark in the history of philosophy, he can be respected as an honest man. But of Eberhard, on the other hand, we can only say and repeat that old saying, had you stayed silent, you would have remained a philosopher. I mentioned this, all of this, not just as a historical remark, but I mention it because this early misunderstanding that Eberhard and Garve had is a misunderstanding that still to this day many people have. And that is why still to this day a lot of attacks on Kant's philosophy can pretty much be dismissed without having to even be refuted, because most attacks, most disagreements just miss the point. They treat Kant as if he was a dogmatic, giving new dogmatic opinions and arguments, and they are not willing to consider that Kant is doing not criticism of the others, but doing self-criticism. And that is what Kant's critics should do too. If Garve or Eberhard had tried not to criticize and refute Kant, but to criticize themselves, to criticize their own thinking, to ask themselves, okay, these things I hold to be true, these topics I disagree on with Kant, how do I come to these truths? How am I justified even in making judgments here? What is the source out of which I believe to be proving my standpoint? If they had done that, then they would have been real philosophers, and then they could have been taken seriously. But that is what most don't do. Most people, even if they are smart people, even if they are learned people, as long as they are unaufkläred people, they will refuse to turn inwards and to look at themselves and criticize themselves. Kant considered it not so much important to prove certain individual sentences, certain individual statements in metaphysics, but rather to find the right method by which to even do this science. He says that other sciences, like mathematics and natural science, also only became true sciences once the right method was found. In the case of mathematics, it was found even back in antiquity. In the case of natural science, it was only found in more recent times to Kant. It was only found after the Renaissance by someone like Francis Bacon, and it is a quote on Francis Bacon, which Kant put at the front of his critique of pure reason. But that is what Kant believes has to be done first. We have to first find the right method of doing metaphysics, and only then can we go back to actually doing that science. And that is what the critique of reason should do. In my lecture on what is metaphysics, I gave an overview of the whole architectonic of the philosophical sciences according to Kant. I talked about its various fields like ontology or theology or cosmology or psychology or physics. And in that whole architectonic, I didn't talk about the critique because the critique has no place in it. Because the critique is not in itself the science. Rather, according to Kant, it is the propaedeutics of the science. So it is that which must come before the science. It must come before all the parts of the science. And in my lecture on what is philosophy, I mentioned how philosophy, according to Kant, has two parts: theoretical philosophy and practical philosophy. And then both of those are sort of connected by the concept of purposiveness. And that's also why you have three critiques. The critique of pure reason is basically laying the groundworks so we can do theoretical philosophy. The critique of practical reason is basically laying the groundworks for practical philosophy. And then the critique of the judgment power is looking at this concept of purposiveness and thereby looking at the connection of both of those. But again, the critique is not in itself the science, it is not the metaphysics, it is what comes before that. And Kant says that not every science needs such critical propaedeutics, but rather there are only two sciences who really need that, and that is metaphysics and history. Because Kant would say there are two ways of gaining knowledge, two ways of getting cognition, and I talked about this in my lecture on what is science. That is experience and reason. And therefore, there are empirical sciences and there are rational sciences. Well, in both of these fields, Kant would say there's a science that doesn't need critique preceding it because it has intuition, it has viewing of some sorts. So in the field of rational science, we have mathematics. And mathematics, as I said before, is construction of concepts in intuition. Therefore, in mathematics, when we make an error, we can spot that error and we can correct that error. We don't really need critique before we can do mathematics, because all people share the same viewing, space and time, and all people view things, for example, geometrical figures, in the same forms of viewing, for example, in space. And in the field of empirical science, you have the natural sciences. Everything, be it nowadays called physics or chemistry or biology. Here too, Kant would say we don't need to do a critique first, because here too we have a sort of intuition. We are not constructing our concepts in our viewing, but we are viewing the things that we deal with. We have experience of them, and we can double check in experience. We can make observations, and we can even make experiments and repeat experiments. And so here too, we can see when we are wrong. So what Kant is saying, that in both of these sciences, in the rational science of mathematics and in the empirical science of natural science, we have a common standard by which to measure what is true and what is wrong. The problem is that in the rational science of metaphysics, because here you are dealing with things like God or the soul, of which you have no viewing and no experience, and in the empirical science of history, because here you are dealing with things that already happened, and so you can't have experience of them anymore, and you can't do experiments anymore. In these two fields, we can apply reason, right? We can come up with arguments why God exists or why we believe that this and that happened in history. But what we lack is a common standard that all people share, by which we can measure what is true and what is false, which argument is right and which argument is incorrect. And that means that in these two sciences, everyone can basically come up with anything he wants. And as long as he comes up with a convincing argument, and as long as he doesn't contradict himself, he can sound kind of convincing, even if he is probably wrong. Kant here also points out how many scholars, even when they have learned a lot already, would not feel comfortable teaching mathematics or teaching physics, but rather would say that they still need to learn more before they can do that. But when it comes to philosophy, be it metaphysics, be it logic, be it morals, everyone feels competent enough to engage in discussion, to have an opinion, and to even teach. And that is because there is no common standard that all people share. There is no shared viewing, according to which we could spot if someone is wrong or if someone is right. And that is why it is these two sciences, history in the field of empirical science and metaphysics in the field of rational science, which can only be done, Kant says, once they have undergone criticism. This criticism in both fields has 4 tasks. First, it needs to go to the sources of our cognition. So it is no longer enough to just try to prove that something is true or that something is untrue, but rather you have to show out of which source you are pulling this proof, where this proof comes from, and if from that source you even can prove that statement you want to prove, right? So in history, if I want to claim something happened, of course, as proof, I can say, here I have an ancient book that writes about this happening. But I have to first be critical of the source, and when I realize, okay, this book is ancient, but still it was written only 500 years after the historical event it is talking about. The second thing we have to do in critique is to find out the extent of our possible knowledge that can come out of those sources. The third, directly connected with the second, is finding out the limits of our possible knowledge, so where that source won't allow us to know more. And fourth, and almost most importantly, all of that has to be answered out of principles. So it is not enough to, like the skeptic, just claim that here there are limits to our cognition, but rather we have to prove that out of a principle. We have to show why exactly here our cognition must end. And the same is true for the dogmatics. So Kant said that all dogmatic philosophy now has to pause, and he didn't want to deal with further dogmatic arguments. So, for example, Kant disproved all previous proofs for God. He showed that all of them were wrong. But he also said, please don't just try to come up with a new proof. I could probably disprove it again, but I don't want to have to do this. Rather, if you want to try and prove God, you first have to justify how that is even possible. You first have to tell me out of which source you claim to have come to the knowledge that God exists. And if you can't explain what your source for that cognition is, then we don't really need to look at your argument and to disprove your argument. Then we can outright dismiss it right away. Again, we can compare that to history. If someone just makes a historical claim, I don't really have to listen to any argument he might have come up with, as long as he can't show me out of which source he claims to have come to this knowledge. When looking at what was made out of this demand for critique, one must come to the conclusion that in the field of history, what Kant demanded was indeed done. Starting somewhat in Kant's own century, but then especially in the 19th century, a historical critical method was developed that is now applied in all fields of history, including the philology. So including when we look at texts, there is now a method of textual criticism that developed, for example, in dealing with the Bible and trying to find out how reliable the text of the Bible is, but that can be applied to other texts as well, including in philosophy. So when it comes to the history of philosophy, when it comes to philologists of philosophy who deal with philosophical texts and with their history, with their various editions, and so on, there's indeed a quite thorough historical critical method that is applied today, and that has indeed given this historical science a good fundament. When it comes to metaphysics, however, then when we look around nowadays, we can only come to the conclusion that Kant is completely ignored. That might be a surprising statement, or even an outrageous statement. How can I claim that Kant is completely ignored when he is widely considered one of the most important philosophers ever, and when there is so much written about Kant, and when Kant is being taught at probably any university around the world that deals with philosophy at all. Well, to that, let me reply that Nietzsche, if you read his second Untimely Meditation, would probably tell you that you can ignore somebody not just by completely dismissing him and throwing him away, but also by erecting monuments to him. Big but lifeless monuments. Let me reply by pointing out that Jesus, for example, is also completely ignored. I mean, for the longest time in Western history, for more or less 2000 years, of course, Jesus was talked about a lot. Of course, you had churches and even cathedrals erected in Jesus' name in pretty much any city or even any small village. But if we consider that Jesus said, love your neighbor, and love not only your neighbor, love even your enemy. And if someone hits you on one cheek, then turn the other cheek. Or that he said, he who is without sin shall throw the first stone. And if we then look at the course of Western or of European history, we can say that if Jesus had not been ignored, that history would have gone differently. For one, there would have been less wars. There would have been less oppression, less persecution of people thinking differently or whatever. Or consider that Jesus said that you should give away your earthly possessions, that a camel going through the eye of a needle is more likely than a rich man going into heaven. And still, despite all of this, you nowadays have people who will tell you that they are the greatest Christians, who are fundamentalists, like, for example, evangelicals in the USA, who will say that they support the death penalty, or who will say that they support capitalism, and who will freak out at everything that they consider even remotely socialist, like universal healthcare. So is it then not allowed to say that these people completely ignore Jesus? Or, for example, I live and I grew up in a very much Mohammedan area. The people here would mostly tell you that they are Muslims, but still it is safe to say that they completely ignore Muhammad. I mean, in the Quran, it is written that you should act beautifully. It is written that when someone does a bad action, you should respond to it with a better action, so that an enemy turns into a friend. Believe me, that is not what you will observe when you go to a school here in my area. You will observe the kids behaving just like, well, all the other kids that don't claim to be Muslim. You will observe the usual bullying and name calling and being mean to each other, being disrespectful to teachers. You won't observe many people acting beautifully. What you will observe is kids fighting, and then one kid going over to hit the other kid, or to call the other kid names, or to throw his school bag away. And when you reproach him for that, he will say, oh, he started it. Might be that the other one started it, but the Quran clearly says that you should not respond in kind, but rather you should respond to a bad action with a better action. That's not what they are doing. And likewise, when you talk to these people, when you ask them what are their goals, you will realize that they are usually complete materialists. Their goals are becoming rich, driving a big car, undergoing plastic surgery, living in Dubai. The most common question by both by classmates and then later by students of mine to me was why I, with the good grades I had, why didn't I become a physician? But not to help people, to maybe save people's lives, but rather because as a physician I would make so much more money. That is all most of them think about. Even though the Quran very clearly says that you should not desire the harvest of this world, but the harvest of the hereafter, and that no one is more in error than he who desires the harvest of this world, and he who follows his own desires instead of following God. So I feel like I'm very much justified when I say that these people completely ignore Muhammad. And so coming back to Kant, we can say that he too is completely ignored. He's talked about, he's celebrated sometimes, but still he is very much ignored. Nowadays, we live in very Unaufkläred, that is, and twilighted, that is, pseudo-Aufkläred times. And that very Misology that Kant talked about is now reigning supreme. So many people will outright dismiss all metaphysics and think that this makes them very aufklärt. To many people, metaphysics was an old superstitious pseudoscience, and it needs to be left behind, just like the gold making of the alchemists, or just like astrology. And many people, when it comes to metaphysics, will now express indifferentism or even contempt for metaphysics. But it must be said, metaphysics, being a science of pure reason, contempt for metaphysics means contempt for reason itself. And I always find it amusing that those who claim to be especially rational are those people who actually dismiss reason and who rather want to stick entirely to the empirical, because they don't really believe in reason. They are what I call a-rationalists. And then on the other hand, there also still, or again, is a lot of dogmatic thinking happening. Like people still trying to answer metaphysical questions by just coming up with arguments without asking the self-critical question, from what source do I even take that argument? And from that source, would it even be possible to talk about this question and to prove anything in this matter or not? So, for example, in the US, there are still debates happening between some Christian fundamentalists and some atheists who have a public debate, probably at some university, trying to prove or disprove God. That's ludicrous. And here, other places like the US are even worse, even more behind than Germany, even though I can tell you that here in Germany, people have not really learned from Kant either, but at least such debates are not as much of a thing here. When you have really studied Kant and really understood Kant, in today's world, you sometimes can't help but feeling like someone who has read and studied Copernicus, and 200 years after Copernicus, like people would still stick to the Ptolemaic worldview, like they would still be geocentrists instead of heliocentrists. Because that is basically the state that philosophy, or more specifically metaphysics, is in. The critique is there. It is before our eyes. It is open to anyone. Anyone could read or study it, but it is ignored. And that is why I want to stress what Kant already said. All dogmatic philosophy from here on after must be dismissed. There is no longer a right, once the critique appeared, to do dogmatic philosophy. You now have to submit yourself to the critique of reason. And to be clear here, you can of course disagree with Kant on the execution of his critical project. Like you can say that he did the critique of reason in a wrong way, and that his answers of what are the sources of our cognition and what therefore can we or can't we know, that these answers are wrong. You can do that if you have arguments supporting that. But then your job would be to do your own critique of reason, to try to execute this project in a better way. But you can't just dismiss the project itself. You can't just deny that before we blindly apply reason, before we blindly use this reason of ours to try and answer certain questions, we should first take a critical look at that reason itself and at what it can and what it can't do. Don't like the look Kant took? Don't think he saw the right things? Then take your own critical look. But do take this critical look. And unfortunately, that's not done. I don't know of any attempt in the last 200 years of philosophy of someone trying to do a better critique of pure reason than Kant had done. No, I only know of people who either agreed with Kant's critique, like me, or people who dismissed not just Kant's critique, but ignored the very project of doing a critique of reason altogether. And that means going back to dogmatic pre-Kantian philosophy. That is primitive. And that means stopping the progress in the field of philosophy. So for that you could be accused of being a darkener, that is an enemy of Aufklärung. But unfortunately that's something that's not just happening to Kant. You can say the same, for example, for the project of his greatest follower and disciple, of Fichte, whose project was that of the Wissenschaftslehre, that is the doctrine of science. That also is a project that has been completely abandoned, even more so than Kant's project. Even though here too, I don't see how you can abandon the project. Maybe you can once again abandon the execution. You can say Fichte didn't do it right. He didn't actually create a real doctrine of science. But the project itself of a doctrine of science, that is a science of science, a science of knowledge itself, I don't see how you can abandon and dismiss this project in itself. But that's exactly what is done. And this leads me to a last remark that I want to close with. The last 200 years of philosophy have been a rhapsody. Thinker followed after thinker, and again you have a new thinker who more or less dismisses what comes before, or who more or less ignores what comes before, and who does his own thing. And then the next thinker doesn't build on that, but again does his own thing. That is not to say that in the last 200 years all of these thinkers have thought completely in isolation. That is not to say that they have not engaged with previous thinkers and have not been influenced by them. But that is not the same as really taking them seriously and thoroughly studying them and really building up on them. That's just taking up some random ideas from others, however you happen to feel. However you happen to like it. And this state of affairs has led to the impression and to the opinion that this is what philosophy is. That philosophy is just philodoxy, love of opinion, namely your own opinions, not a science. That philosophy is just that there is no history of philosophy. There is no progress in philosophy, no development, not one building on what came before, but rather that philosophy is just a bunch of individual people coming up with individual ideas. And now there is this relativist opinion that one idea is as good as the other and nothing can be proven anyways. There is no real truth. And this opinion is not just held by the broader public, it has even infiltrated the academy. It is even held by experts. That is how I was greeted when I started studying at the university. The president of our institute, in her welcoming speech, said basically that it's just a bunch of opinions and you pick out what you like best. If you ask, if I really believed that was what philosophy was, I would not waste my time with it. Why should I waste my time with other people's opinions? I can have opinions of my own. And if all opinions are the same and are equally good, then my opinions are as good as those of Kant or of other thinkers. So why waste my time with theirs? And what we can also observe is that this impression that the last 200 years, more or less, of philosophy since Kant's death give off, that this is now retro-projected onto the whole history of philosophy. So people will now believe that even in all the centuries before Kant, that was the case, that philosophy was just a bunch of disconnected opinions and every new philosopher coming with new opinions. But that was not the case. In older times, there were schools of philosophy. I mean, I talked in this lecture about the Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy, which had big influence for a few decades, for most of the 18th century in Germany. And if you go further back, you can find schools that lasted even longer. You will find that for more or less the whole Middle Ages, Aristotle was considered the philosopher. And philosophy was largely built on Aristotle, or how Aristotle was interpreted. And of course, if you go back to antiquity, you find schools like the Platonic school or like the Stoic school that lasted for centuries or even for millennia. That is not to say that there weren't different opinions within those schools, or that their thoughts didn't progress, but still there was a basic fundament of thinking that the school probably agreed on. And there probably was a great founder of that school on whose philosophy they agreed on, even if they probably didn't agree completely on how to interpret it. And in older times, there was a willingness to take those who came before you seriously. Because in older times, there was a belief in truth. And there was the belief that even if those who had come before you had not found the full truth, maybe they had found some part of the truth, and maybe you could build on that. And that is a belief that has been lost. That has been lost so thoroughly, once again, that we even project this loss of belief back in time into times when it wasn't yet lost. But the reason for this is that past centuries were before the age of Aufklärung. So that was a time when people still believed in tradition and in authority. What happened is that we underwent negative Aufklärung. That is, we let go of prejudice, we let go of tradition. We don't blindly follow authority anymore, which is a good thing, but which is only half of the Aufklärung, which is only the first step. The second step that should follow, but has not followed yet, would be positive Aufklärung. And that would mean to once again submit, but this time not submit blindly to some authority, but rather submit consciously to reason, to truth. But as long as we don't do this, as long as we don't do this second step, this positive Aufklärung, but just the negative one, just dismissing authorities and just refusing to submit at all, even to reason, then what will reign is the ego and the individual opinion. That is the state we are in now. If we ever pass this state, if we ever get to more positive Aufklärung and submit to reason, then I firmly believe we will go back to the critique of reason. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Samet Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufkläring cause.